Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
And a very special guest. We have Sandy Phillips Kirkham with us. Sandy, very nice to have you.
It's good to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So Sandy is she is one of our newer patrons of the podcast. So first of all, we want to thank you for being a patron. That's really incredible. And she is also a survivor of child sexual abuse at the hands of her youth pastor. And Sandy, I didn't know this until I read your book, but actually I'm going to hold it up here. This is Sandy's book, Let Me Pray With You. And it's P-R-E-Y, Pray Upon You. So pray with is crossed out, if you can see that. And then it's Pray Upon You, which I think is a brilliant title. But we share a background in Restoration Movement churches. So you are part of the instrumental Churches of Christ Christian churches. And of course, we're in the Churches of Christ, non-instrumental. So we share a lot of history. So yeah, I guess we'll start by letting you briefly tell your story, or not so briefly. You can share whatever you're comfortable sharing with. But for those who haven't read the book, I think given this backdrop to your story is really important. And I don't know about you, but I was gripped the entire book. I mean, from cover to cover.
Incredible. I was telling Sandy I did read it. What I didn't tell Sandy is I didn't put it down until I read it cover to cover.
Oh wow! Well,
it is an amazing book. It you are great at just capturing every emotion, every detail. It's an invaluable book.
It is.
I really cannot say enough about it. And for those who are interested in abuse within ministry, this is a book you must have. It's a resource that I feel people should have.
For sure.
Sandy, thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mm-hmm. So my story is that I was, as a teenager, very, very active and involved in my church. I absolutely loved being at church. I loved every aspect of church. If there was an activity to be involved in, I was either involved in it or I was the leader of that particular activity. I was baptized into the church when I was 13 and found everything about church just a wonderful place to be. When I was just before I turned 16, our church hired a new youth minister. And from the very beginning, it was quite clear he was different from any youth minister or pastor we'd ever seen. This was the early 70s, so he came with a little bit longer hair, sideburns. He dressed a little bit differently. Even though he was married and he was about 30 years old and with 2 children, he really acted more like the youth group and played more in our activities opposed to being the typical married pastor. He drove a convertible. He knew our music. I guess you would say in the 70s vernacular, he was hip. He was cool. And he also had a very dynamic personality. He was very charismatic. People were drawn to him. There was just an aura about him that really was exciting. And with that, he changed our youth group as well and brought that same excitement to our youth group. The boring Sunday school lessons went out the door, and in came these interactive skits. We had different kinds of music. There was an excitement and a change in our youth group. And basically, our youth group was like 25 kids when he first came, and we went to almost 200 kids in a very short time. And people that's how dynamic he was.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And so people were coming from all over the city to go to the church, not only for our programs and the excitement, but also to see this new cool minister. And so this was kind of the atmosphere that was in the church at the time when he first came. One night we had a youth group meeting at my home, and he waited for everyone to leave so that we were alone. And then he walked over to me and told me how much he appreciated me and how much he appreciated the fact that I worked in the church, and just kind of complimenting me. And all of a sudden, he just bent down and he kissed me, not once, but twice. And I was stunned, and I thought, I think he just kissed me. And then I thought, well, this is my minister. He wouldn't be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. And it didn't quite seem right, but it didn't quite seem wrong. I really couldn't process it. So I just thought, well, this is his way of showing how much he appreciates me. And I just kind of let it go. A few days later, I was babysitting at his home. His wife worked evenings, so I babysat 3 and 4 times a week. And this really gave him the perfect opportunity to be alone with me. And we would sit and talk about the church. We'd talk about the Bible. He would give me books to read. And it really seemed very natural to me to be spending this time with him. Sometimes he would kiss me. Sometimes he wouldn't. There really wasn't a pattern to it. So I didn't really see anything wrong with it. I just accepted it that this was okay. And that went on for about a year. And I call that the grooming year. That was the year he spent gaining my trust, making me feel special, making me feel important. For his goal then was to have sex with me, which he eventually did. And once he crossed that line, he made me promise never to tell anyone. He made sure that I understood that even if I told someone, they weren't going to believe me. And I can remember thinking, I don't even believe this is happening to me. And honestly, I wasn't going to tell anyone because I didn't want anyone to know what I was doing, that I had done this. And so I kept a secret. And the abuse lasted about 5 years. This relationship went on for 5 years.
And you were 17 when he first had sex with you, is that
Yes, I was
correct?
16 when he kissed me and 17 when we had sex. Now, I wasn't his first victim. Shortly after he arrived at our church, a young woman came forward from his first church and accused him of inappropriate behavior. When my elders and senior minister at the time confronted him with that information, he didn't deny it. He said it was true, but he asked for forgiveness. He promised he would never do it again. And he was allowed then to remain as our youth minister, and no information was given to the congregation about this incident. And then within 6 months of that accusation, that's when he had kissed me in my hallway. So this abuse lasted about 5 years until 2 people in the church became suspicious and followed him one night and found us together.
And that was that the one that was out of state, if I remember?
Yes. So the elders were informed, and it was decided that they would try to keep this information quiet, and that the goal was to get him moved to the next church. So for 3 months, now by this time, he had been promoted to senior minister. He'd been at the church almost 5 years. The abuse lasted 5 years. He had been promoted to senior minister at this point. So for 3 months, while the elders were aware of this situation, he remained as our pastor. I was told not to tell anyone. I was told I couldn't tell my parents. It was all to keep everything quiet so he could be moved to the next church, which he was. Shortly after his departure, I was called into the church by 2 elders and told that because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. This is really the hardest part of my story for me, because I loved that church. It was my life. And to be told that I was no longer fit to worship there was devastating to me. And I look back on that, and I now recognize and understand that the response of the church was probably more hurtful and had more of an impact on my life than the actual abuse did. So I left the church as I was told to do, and for probably a year I was adrift. I had no place to go. I didn't know how to live my life. I felt a lot of guilt and shame until I was able to finally, I met my husband. We married. We had 2 great kids. I went on with my life, but that abuse stayed with me my entire life because I kept a secret for 27 years. I never told anyone about it. My husband didn't know, my family, my friends, no one knew about it. And to be able to hide a secret and to carry that guilt and shame for 27 years really impacted my life in a lot of ways, and sometimes ways that I didn't even recognize. But as I describe in my book in chapter 1, a trigger factor forced me then to face the truth and to face the fact that I was abused, and that this wasn't a love affair. This wasn't someone who cared about me. This was sexual abuse. And then from that point on, I had then to figure out how to move forward and how to heal. And it wasn't an easy journey. It took time, and it was difficult at times to do that. But I was able to finally move from a victim to survivor to an advocate, and which led me to where I am today. I volunteer for a ministry that helps adult women who've been sexually abused, and I also serve on the board of council on child abuse. So I've come to a point in my life where I've healed, but it's a part of my life that I've always had to deal with.
Yeah. What was really striking to me, just throughout reading your entire story, is how calculated your abuser was, and he would do things like, even talk to you about other victims that he had, and
Yes.
brag about it and say, I got away with it. And there was physical violence, which is not incredibly common when you have child sexual abuse, but this guy went beyond just being a sexually abusive person. He was physically violent. He was verbally abusive, spiritually abusive, and crazy. Yeah.
The relationship, as it continued, he became more controlling. He became more domineering. As you said, there was some violent acts that occurred. He got me to a point where I could no longer think for myself. I was totally, totally under his control. And it was methodical, and it was very systematic how it happened. And in the beginning, I was on a pedestal, and slowly he would chip away at that pedestal to the point where I was underneath him, and I couldn't think for myself. And honestly, I didn't see a way out. I didn't feel like I could tell anyone. He certainly made me believe that no one was going to believe me. I mean, probably one of the most hurtful things he would say to me is the fact that no one else could love me. I wasn't could be loved by anyone else. I was no longer a virgin, therefore I couldn't be loved by anyone else. And as you know, in the Church of Christ, or in most faiths, we're taught that sex before marriage is a sin. And so it was easy for me then to believe his lies and what he told me. He told me how I could dress, where I could go, who I could see. Everything was under his control. And I felt like I was in a black hole with no way out. That's really how I felt. Yeah. And so I began to accept the relationship. I figured this was my life. This was not going to be over until he said it would be over.
Well, and he even controlled who you dated, and would find out, if you talked about anything related to him, that's what really struck me, is if ever there's any doubt that an abuser knows exactly what they're doing, just listen to your story. He knew exactly what he was doing.
As I read your story, Sandy, and I read about how he actually chose people for you to date. He actually set up dates for you, and then would, I call it, monitor those and question. And he would, spy, whatever you want to call it. But he was so controlling and so abusive, and messed so much with your mind.
Absolutely.
I understand how you're talking about feeling like you were in that dark, deep hole with no way out.
And yet, if you were to have met this man, and the entire congregation had absolutely no clue, no inkling of this evil side of him. And I can remember sitting in church, and he would be giving this eloquent sermon, and I could look around and I think, they don't know him. They don't know him. And yet I didn't feel like I could tell them, because I thought, well, they're not going to believe this. And because they thought he practically walked on water. So that's the other thing about, I think, abusers. They not only manipulate the victim, but they manipulate those around them, and they control somewhat those people around them so that they have their little tribe that supports them. So when he was discovered, there wasn't any reason to discipline him or to hold him accountable, because they saw him as this wonderful person who made a mistake.
From the youth group, he had moved up to senior pastor. He had done all these marvelous things. Meanwhile, he's stripping you just step by step of your self-worth, of your believing anything about yourself that would be good. And it was very, as Jimmy and you both said, methodical, very well thought out, very, very. And he started when you were young, took that whole first year. I look at that first kiss as the test. You passed the test.
Correct.
You didn't tell.
I mean, yeah, and it was innocent enough.
Test.
I mean, innocent, but it was not illegal to give you a little peck and something that could be.
He could explain away.
Exactly right.
Explain away.
Exactly right. So there's,
yes.
I've collaborated with neuroscientists and just understanding how the brain works and how we miss things that are right in front of us. And one of the biggest factors is ambiguity. When ambiguity is introduced into any scenario, whether it's magicians introduce just a slight amount of ambiguity, just something that's off a little bit, our brain doesn't know what to do with that, and so it starts filling in the gaps. And so, even though people, more than likely, people around you for 5 years had to have seen some things that were going on. In fact, you had a friend at one point that came to you and she's like, is there something going on?
Yeah.
Right.
People saw certain little signs, but because there was a little bit of ambiguity that he introduced into this situation, people's brains automatically just fill in the gaps. And it's like, oh, well, this guy there, it's not even on their radar that he could be doing that because the brain is constantly filling in the gaps and creating shortcuts. And they see the good sermons and the growing youth group and the growing church and, the eloquent speech and the charisma and, the brain fills in all those gaps and says, here is a good guy.
And if we don't fill in the gaps the way our minds want it to go, then we'd have to do something about it. Then we'd have to go to that other side to say, okay, maybe this isn't what I think it is. So we don't want to go to we don't want to know the truth because the truth would require action. And that's the other part of, I think. And there were people in the congregation who would later say to me, well, there was that time I saw whatever, or, I thought it was a little odd that time that he did this or said this to you. So there were the signs, but as you say, your mind isn't going to let you go there. It won't let you go there. It actually stops you from going there because how can you possibly think this of this particular person?
Right.
That's right. And I mean, and that's science. I mean, whether we like it or not, that's science. That's how we're wired. And so the only way that we can really overcome that is to be open to the possibility that people are capable of sin and they're capable of hiding it. And until we're open to that possibility, we're never going to see it. And the abusers know it, which is why the church, I mean, and the church is a hotbed for abuse. And every secular researcher into child sexual abuse will say, hands down, church is the number one target that abusers migrate to.
And
hands down.
Well, because you have people who are coming with vulnerabilities, you have a lot of children, you have parents who are maybe compromised emotionally, who aren't, their children then are more vulnerable to a predator. In my case, that certainly was there. I mean, I needed a father figure. My parents were divorced, and so I didn't see my dad a lot during my teenage years. So he knew all that. He tapped into that. As I tell a lot of victims, I said, this didn't happen by accident. You were targeted. They looked for your vulnerabilities. They learn about you. What is it that they can tap into to make you trust them, to let you open up to them where you wouldn't open up to anyone else? And then they use that vulnerability and they exploit it and they use it for their own gratification. And it's one of the most horrific things one person can do to another is to betray a trust that you've given to them.
Yeah. And, you said something too that I've heard 100% of the time. I've never heard a survivor of abuse ever say the reverse of what you said, where the abuse was worse than the church's reaction to it or response to it. Always, 100% of the time, it's exactly how you describe it, that the church's response was far worse than the actual abuse. And I'm reading your book, right? And you and I mean, Mom, you and I talked to countless victims of sexual abuse and domestic violence and you name it. In my wildest dreams, I can't imagine anything worse than the degradation, humiliation, constant threats, constant fear, constant guilt trips, shaming, doing all this stuff in the name of God, the poisoning of love. I can't imagine anything worse than that. And for me, as a church leader, that speaks to the importance that we get it right.
Right.
And no matter how hard I try to express this, I have friends in ministry that I've lost all faith in them.
Mhm.
Not everybody, but a lot of
Right.
them. And a case in point was, just today I just posted. It was an article on John Ortberg.
Mhm.
I was somewhat involved with that behind the scenes, and RNS did a story on that just today. It just published.
Oh, okay.
Right before we interviewed you.
Okay.
Literally 30 minutes before. I posted that in this group, which is made up mostly of ministers, and I was quoted in the article, but whatever. That's neither here nor there. And I posted that, and one of the admins of this private group just like shot back immediately, is like, we already discussed this in a previous thread. And like this guy
Wow.
constantly gets
Mhm.
these jabs in at me. And I'm like, it's not like we're these radical wackos who are going around like, pointing the finger in every direction and saying that all church leaders are bad. We're just saying like this stuff happens. So we should have the humility to really think through these issues. And
Well,
I get so much pushback from that
yeah.
constantly.
Well, here's the thing. It's interesting because churches are always seem shocked when they find out they've got someone in their midst who does this.
Yes.
Well, they're wolves in sheep's clothing. They're false prophets. Do you know that the Bible mentions wolves in sheep's clothing and false prophets 27 times? We're warned 27 times at a minimum that
Yeah.
these men are among us. So we shouldn't be surprised when we find them, but it's what we do with them when we do find them.
Mhm.
So, when the shock shouldn't be there. We're warned over and over in the Bible about these men and how they will be among us. And so, when churches seem to be upset about, we got to protect the reputation of the church and we don't want anyone to know, that's not the fault of you. The fault comes when you don't handle the situation correctly.
Yeah.
And you make the victim, become, she's the blame. She's the cause.
Mhm.
She's the problem. Or this,
Yes.
and I've heard of children being blamed, that they're emotionally have some issues. And so therefore, it was, and it's like, really, this is not what we do.
Yeah.
No.
This is just so wrong, Sandy, on every level. The response that that was done to you. I can't hear. Am I talking okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have such allergies, so excuse me. But as I was listening to you tell your story, when you said the greatest pain was being told to leave the church, that was your family. And when I think of hell, to me, my hell would be for Jesus, for my Lord, to separate me eternally from my family.
Yeah.
Mhm.
From those who you love the most.
Yes,
Yeah.
those that I
Mhm.
love the most, not just my physical, blood related family, but those I love the most. And when that decision is made to a person who has been abused, I have to say something that might not be liked by a lot of people, but I also think that's a very calculated response. In that, when you make that response and you know that you're cutting a person off, you were not just a person, you were so involved in the church.
Mhm.
The church was your life, it was your blood, it was your everything. And they cut you off to save embarrassment. And that's basically what it comes down to. Embarrassment, and it would have meant
And they
some.
were angry. They were
Yes.
angry that they had to let go of this wonderful
Yep.
pastor because
Mhm.
of what I had done.
Absolutely.
They didn't. In fact, there was a vote to see if they could keep him, and that vote failed. But there was a discussion among the elders that they wanted to keep him. So there was also not only the embarrassment. I think it had a lot to do with the anger that I had caused this pastor to fall. I'd caused this,
Mhm.
and so therefore they were going to lose him because of what I had done. Now, I do want to say this. Part of my healing, and you know this from the book, but for your listeners, part of my healing was that I wanted to confront my abuser.
Yes.
So 27 years later, I hired an investigator and I found him, I confronted him. But a big part of my healing was also that I wanted to go back to that church for them to acknowledge that what was done to me was wrong. And I made it very clear from the beginning, this wasn't about current elders. None of those were there at the time. So this wasn't about blaming them, but I wanted an acknowledgement from the church. And I think for their own spirituality, they needed to acknowledge the wrong that had happened in that church.
Yes.
So I do want to say that that church was very gracious and very willing to meet with me, and they did, and they allowed me to say whatever I wanted to say and what I needed to say to them at that meeting. And so, yes, 27 years earlier, they had absolutely had epic failure in how they handled that situation. But to the credit of those current elders, they were very gracious in allowing me to come, and which was huge in my healing. Now, I say that, but the two elders who actually told me to leave the church refused to acknowledge that they'd had any part in it. But I do want to thank the current elders of the church now, because I think it would have been difficult for me to have moved on without having that meeting without the church.
Right. Absolutely.
And the church, I mean, weren't they trying to stop you from meeting with those two men too?
Yes, they were.
Elders. Yeah, because their health was frail, and you were going to be responsible for giving them a heart attack and putting them in the grave. And once again, that guilt goes to you.
Yes. And I wasn't deterred, if you read the book. They refused to contact the two elders, so I did that on my own. And again, I think it wasn't just for me, but I think for them, they needed to acknowledge what they had done. And of course, both of them said they had nothing to do with that. They don't remember telling me to leave the church. And I had a letter that, from 1976. And so, and that's okay. I mean, after we met with the one elder and he denied meeting me, saying that he told me to leave the church, and I was so upset. We got into the car and my husband said to me, I don't know what would have been so hard for him to have said. I don't remember doing that, but if I did, I'm sorry. He couldn't even acknowledge that there was a possibility that it happened. And, for 27 years, I really carried that guilt with me. And I can remember thinking, if my friends knew that I was bad enough to be kicked out of a church, what would they really think of me? I mean, that's what I carried for 27 years until I had that trigger factor that told me, wait a minute, that's not what happened to you. And you need to understand so that you can let go of this guilt and shame. It took a while, but I was able to do it.
Yeah.
Thankfully.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I like to, I mean, I don't know about you, but what really jumped out of the book probably more than anything is your persistence and not backing down in making your abuser own the guilt. And even the way that you worded the questions, and you made him read it in front of the whole group, and I love that.
I did. I love that. I appreciated that so much.
And you were clear in the book. This is not about shaming you. It's not about guilting you. It's about for your healing. You had to hear him own that he knew that what he did was wrong. And the what he did to you hurt you. And so those questions were framed. How did you frame them? I was wrong when and then you listed.
I had like 16 things. Yeah.
And
I came to that because I knew he was going to say he was sorry. I knew he was going to say, oh, I shouldn't have done that, but it wouldn't have acknowledged what he did. And I needed him to articulate to me. And that came at the suggestion of a friend of mine who said, and his suggestion was, I had started to say this, I'm sorry for whatever. I'm sorry for this. I'm sorry for that. And my friend said, no, he needs to say I was wrong. And so that was powerful for me to be able to have him read that list to me. Now he acknowledged at the end that, he didn't doubt that any of it was true, but he didn't remember all of it, which was hurtful that he couldn't remember all of that, but that's okay. He read the list. And what I really learned was that my moving forward and my healing could not be dependent upon his asking for my forgiveness. It couldn't be dependent on what he remembered and what he thought. It had to come from within myself and not dependent upon him. Because I wasn't going to get from him what I really wanted. And that's what I really wanted was for him to understand what he did to my spiritual life. And that never registered with him. Yeah.
Yeah. I can speak from our experience, but this was not coming from my dad because, he in his letters always minimizes, but still to this day, he minimizes. And, I'm very blunt with him. He knows that I know a whole lot more than he thought that I ever would find out. He still minimizes that. And so one of his victims, as an adult came and spoke to me, and she wanted to talk about some of the things that had happened, not in great detail, but she just felt like she had to talk about some of that stuff and how it's weighed her down, which I would never turn that down. I allowed her to talk. And I asked her a question. I said, if you're comfortable answering this, it's something that I've really struggled with for my own knowledge. Did my dad know that the things that he was doing to you hurt you? And it's probably too graphic of an answer to say it on the air, but her response was unequivocally, absolutely, with tears streaming down my face and me begging him to stop. If that was any indication that he was hurting me, you better believe he knew. Mm-hmm. And that has always registered with me, because when you're face to face with these guys, they're so daggone convincing.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that unless you've experienced that as a survivor or as a family member, as a spouse of an abuser, unless you've experienced that level of deception, it's nearly impossible to convince church leaders that, yes, these guys are so full of crap that they're going to have you eating out of the palm of their hand. I will give you 5 minutes in the room alone with an abuser, and you'll be eating out of the palm of their hand. I'll guarantee it.
You're absolutely right. They are calculating, and they know they know how to manipulate people. They're good at it. They're very good at it. So, and that's why it's so difficult for church leaders then to discipline them, because you're right. They have connived and calculated to a point where they've got everyone under their control and spell.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of our interview with Sandy Phillips Kirkham. To all our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode, and we'll catch you next episode for part 2.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.